Yu-Gi-Oh! Was designed to be a story and game about being empowered in a setting other than those that our society traditionally wants from us. It's about setting goals and self-improvement. It's about finding connection with other players.
It's about making money. It's about selling cardboard crack. It's about cashing in on this one obscure side story that they had in a popular manga series, and taking a really good deal. That's all it was. That's all it really is. It's like
Ursarctic could be a perfectly good deck. This is
okay. I have to say, my level of excitement and willingness to engage with this topic has definitely dropped down. Like it was at like 100, like right here, and now it's just like in the negative values. Stop. I feel like tying in like my value as a human, value as a person into these discussions about like what is good, what is bad in a children's card game. I feel like that's so weird. That's so sad. It's like that's not what we're talking about. Like no one's trying to say that Abyss is a bad person or that they're a dumb player or that they're stupid, right? They're just saying like this archetype is not good in the general agreed upon context of what we gauge success in, which is competitive viability. Like it doesn't, no one's trying to say or diminish your worth as a human. Just you can like your things. Like it's so silly. It seems so obvious. TheDuelLogs made a video about failed cards, failed archetypes, and one person on Twitter got really mad that it had Ursarctics on it, and we're gonna see if there's more discussion on what a bad deck is, what a good deck is. So let's see.
Hello, kings, queens, and monarchs of every element. I'm RJ the Jank Monarch, and last week the entire Yugi sphere was captivated by one piece of discourse. What makes a bad deck? There were a lot of conversations about it, a lot of not so conversations about it, and a lot of people weighing in with very strong opinions and surprisingly strong feelings on the subject. I even got my 2 cents in a reasonable and totally non-
Oh, Yu-Gi-Oh player base having strong opinions about their pet decks that they pour all their time into. Couldn't expect that. If you're so obsessed with your opinions on bad decks that you dogpile that Yu-Gi-Oh player who is arguably the best in the game at achieving her goals with any deck, maybe the problem isn't that she doesn't know what a bad deck is. Maybe it's simply that you're a bad player. Okay, I hope he unpacks this. I definitely... Who? I don't know who he's talking about.
Format, but today I want to elaborate on my ideas around what makes a bad deck and what it says about our feelings about success as a whole in Yu-Gi-Oh! As I alluded to just now, in order to understand what makes a deck good or bad, we have to find a definition for success. After all, something is good if it brings you success, and it's bad if it doesn't. I think that's a pretty fair framework in the world of competitive game. Now,
yeah, again, my opinion on the good deck versus bad deck, it depends on the context you're speaking about it in. It's obvious when TheDuelLogs is talking about failed cards, failed archetypes, right? That he's talking about it in the context of, you know, tournament performance and, you know, just overall competitive viability. Does Yu-Gi-Oh community have any sort of say or wherewithal to understand what is actually competitive viable, what is actually objectively good or not? Probably not, because there's just not a lot of people playing it. There's not as much data as something like modern Magic the Gathering, for instance, right? But I do think that you know, that's more to MBT's point on what a good deck versus a bad deck is. But as far as the conversation of good deck versus bad deck, it just seems clear to me that it depends on the context, right? Does it achieve your goals? What are you trying to accomplish with it? What is the context that we're speaking in? And the context in failed decks and archetypes. I don't know. I haven't really watched the TheDuelLogs video, but I would guess that it is like tournament play and competitive viability in tournaments, right? Because that's the only thing Yu-Gi-Oh players care about. What is good, what is bad, what fails, what succeeds is the one format, is in the context of the one format that Konami pushes. Advanced TCG, OCG format. That's it. Right.
This is an interesting thing when it comes to the Yu-Gi-Oh community and our culture, in that we seem to bring a lot of different definitions of success to the table functionally when it comes to actually feeling successful and expressing feelings of success, but not really when it comes to how we discuss success.
I mean, that's fine. I think having different definitions for success and, again, like, does this deck accomplish my goals? Did I get to pull off my funny little synchro combo, or did I get to win a YCS, right? It's like everyone has different goals for their decks and what they want to do. So
people talk about feeling achieved or happy with what they've done, there are a lot of ways that you see that happening. Looking around at my social media, it seems like there are a lot of different results that cause people to feel achievement, that cause people to be happy with their time playing Yu.
Oh, big shocker. In a card game where there's so many like ways to express skill and there's so many ways to express gameplay than just winning and losing, like performing funny, obscure combos and having a large number of card interactions, right? Or just being like unstoppable if you're not stopped. There's like a lot of different ways people gauge success, and I feel like that's not a huge shocker for me.
Yu-Gi-Oh! That caused people to feel successful. When I came back to the game after 5 years and attended a locals for the first time in most of a decade at the Age of Overlord sneak preview, I was happy with an X2 finish, where I met a lot of people, learned a lot about the deck I was playing, and got to mess around and have some weird games. That was a successful day to me. I was raving about that on Twitter, and I've seen a lot of people feel similarly. There are duelists who will be happy to win a locals, that'll be really proud of what they've done. Topping a regionals is a big mark of success for a lot of competitive players. Regionals are the primary place that a lot of us get to test our mettle on the battlefield. But if you ask a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players, success only comes with winning at the highest level of competition possible. The only really successful Yu-Gi-Oh players are the people who have won YCSs.
I mean, yeah, is that really surprising at all that the culture around Yu-Gi-Oh is created around the context of what Konami like pushes? Is it really a huge surprise that Yu-Gi-Oh community only cares about what wins and loses in this one hyperfixated format, advanced format, when that's the only thing that Konami rewards Nintendo Switches for, right? Or like, I don't know. I feel like it's not a huge surprise that so many people care about winning and losing in this one advanced format, because that's what Konami supports.
And even within that group, people who have won multiple. Or if you ask one prominent Yu-Gi-Oh player within the Twitter community if you've won a YCS that's smaller than most regionals. This mindset, quite frankly, sucks. Kazuki Takahashi didn't make Yu-Gi-Oh so you could make Daddy Tate proud by being the strongest boy on the playground. Yu-Gi-Oh was designed to be a story and game about being empowered in a setting other than those that our society traditionally wants from us. It's about setting goals and self-improvement. It's about finding connection with other people.
It's about making money. It's about selling cardboard crack. It's about cashing in on this one obscure side story that they had in a popular manga series, and taking a really good deal. That's all it was. That's all it really is. It's like the morality and like the story behind Yu-Gi-Oh and how it's about friendships and I guess accomplishing goals or whatever. Yeah, that makes sense, but like, and it does exist to a degree, but so does, just what it really is making money and cashing in and selling cardboard crack to children.
Players finding friendship in rivalry. If you only view success in Yu-Gi-Oh as being at the top of the pile, as this zero-sum game of I win and you lose, you're entirely missing the point of the game's existence. That doesn't mean you can't set lofty goals and try to achieve great things. It's a noble goal to try and win a YCS. It's a great thing to try and find how you can become better, build better decks, find more avenues through which you can win the game. That's cool. That's sick. I'm glad for anybody who can do that. But it's important to recognize that only you can define what success in Yu-Gi-Oh is for you. Whatever it is that you want to achieve, that's what success looks like. That could be anything from winning worlds to having a positive record at your locals with a brew you just made up. If I were to think about the folks who I consider the top players in terms of their success in Yu-Gi-Oh!, I'd start with Jesse Cotton. Not only is he one of the best players in terms of event tops, but he's also a phenomenal teacher and has been a pillar of the community. He's somebody that teaches us how to be great at the game, not just by having accolades to his name. I'd also see Keegan from E3 Yu-Gi-Oh! As an extremely successful player. The man resurrected a format from the dead and made it the most popular way to play the TCG since, well, the TCG. Along with those two, I'd put Abyss Yu-Gi-Oh! And Nick Gibson, my old friend from back in my Dice Age Games days. Those two are people who were constantly brewing new things and were always achieving things you wouldn't expect to be possible with the decks that they put together. Both Nick and Abyss are known for being terrors at their locals because they put together decks with a very clear goal in mind and are extremely good at achieving that. They see potential in cards that others don't. This might not be landing them at the top tables at Nats, but they're flexing their creative and competitive brains in mind-blowing ways and seeing shocking win rates as a result. Winning locals with Chaz Tira week after week is a pretty impressive accomplishment in my mind. So with that definition of success in mind, the conversation about good and bad decks becomes very interesting very quickly. If success is achieving the goal you set yourself to, then a good deck is a deck that achieves your goals. That throws into question a lot of things. For example, Kashtira before Arise Heart was banned was a great way to top a regionals or win a YCS. But if your goal was to do something creative or have a fun day at locals, Kashtira before Arise Heart was banned was a terrible deck. This is why the deck that seemed to be at the center of the most discord on X, I almost called it the thing, on Twitter was so contentious. Ursarctic is not a deck that is going to win you a YCS right now. But if you see winning locals multiple times in a row or topping a regional as being successful, sure, Ursarctic could be a perfectly good deck. This is
okay. I have to say, my level of excitement and willingness to engage with this topic has definitely dropped down. Like, it was at like 100, like right here, and now it's just like in the negative values because it's just like, for something that's so painfully obvious that everyone has their own definition of success and that this has to be, I guess, discussed or talked about or reminded to people, it's just like, yeah, of course. It's really easy to understand why the Yu-Gi-Oh community are so passionate or wanting to say and pin this down as a bad deck, or Ursarctics as a bad deck, because in reality, like, that's the culture that they've built, right? That's the culture that is built around Yu-Gi-Oh! Is competitive viability, topping YCSs, winning regionals. That is the general context in which everyone is talking about and speaking in. And Ursarctics are a bad deck for that. They're horrible.
Why you'll get a lot of pushback from casual players if you say that their pet deck is bad. Their definition of success is different from the one that you're using. To a casual player, doing well at a small event with their favorite deck is successful.
I still think that makes them wrong, though. I would say, like, Abyss or like anyone who's like, oh no, my deck is good, it's not bad, how dare you say it's bad? I would say they're flat out wrong. I feel like it's very obvious, it's very easy to understand the context in which people are speaking in. And when people are talking about failed deck types and failed archetypes from a card design point or whatever, it's still within the general context of like what is being played, what is popular, what is competitively viable, what is doing well in a competitive setting, because that's the general context. That is the agreed upon context without having to talk about it, without having to discuss it, that everyone is speaking in. It's competitive viability. I feel like people who are so quick to say, oh no, my deck isn't bad, like, you're arguing my deck isn't bad because it accomplishes my goals. Okay, yeah, you're basically arguing against the straw man at that point. No one's going to legitimately tell you that your deck that you make, that you have fun with, that you are using isn't accomplishing your goals, right? That's not what anyone is saying. No one's discussing that. We're talking about competitive viability and how well it does. That's what it is. And to say like, how dare you say my deck is bad or say that, it's a failed archetype, it's like we're talking about two completely different things. Like, it's very important to realize that we're talking about two very different things. And it just doesn't, when you're talking about two different things, you're not having a conversation. Just flat out. You're talking against a ghost and I'm talking against a ghost, right? It's not, there's no connection. You're basically arguing against something that no one said. And I feel like some people don't know how to express that, especially when it comes to Twitter arguments over the internet, that we're missing the point. We're missing each other. There is a miscommunication. I'm not saying that your deck doesn't accomplish your goals. Why? How the fuck would I know what your goals are, right? I'm saying that this deck, this archetype fails in a competitive setting, the general context that we as a community agree is like what we're talking about. It's very obvious that there is miscommunication.
There are still some decks within that framework that probably aren't going to be good. If you wanted to get your Nats invite with crash bugs, you're probably not going to be successful. It's probably a bad deck. But even within the vast ocean of untiered decks in Yu-Gi-Oh!, there are a lot of decks that somebody might consider good. Even if you're changing your conversation from the very clearly subjective good and bad to the somewhat less subjective seeming strong or weak, you're still not going to be able to create a successful binary between something that is strong and something that is weak. You wouldn't call Usain Bolt a weak person because he can't compete with professional weightlifters. There are people who are strong, there are people who are stronger, and not everybody who isn't the strongest is weak. The same goes for Yu-Gi-Oh! The definition of what is strong and what is not strong is going to be flexible. This is why
it's flexible, obviously. Like, again, it depends on the context. But what is the general context? What do people have an agreed upon setting of, like, speaking in, right? What is the agreed upon context that is agreed upon without words, without discussion? It is competitive viability, because that's the culture that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is built around. Is competitive viability, YCS tops, right? That's what it is. To not recognize that and say, how dare you call my deck bad? It's not bad in this context. It's like, we're not talking about the same thing.
Tier lists are such a useful tool when it comes to discussing decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! You can set the parameters for your tier list and then rank decks against each other based on your opinions on those decks' strengths under those categories. You can make a tier list that is the standard competitive tier list. These are the decks that are in the entire field of decks, the ones that are most likely to win you any given event. A lot of people also constrain their tier lists in other ways. Their budget tier list, their rogue tier list. I think ranking decks against each other is a perfectly valuable way to discuss things in Yu-Gi-Oh! Whereas trying to call things good and bad and trying to create some kind of objective framework around those isn't helpful and just speaks to a mindset that hurts the game and hurts the community. And that's
I don't agree with that. Like, good and bad is obviously subjective. Yu-Gi-Oh! Community obviously doesn't have enough data to formulate what is good and bad, but people can still freely talk about it and they can have their discussions, and the general agreed upon context is YCS tops and competitive viability. That's what the conversation is around. And unless we are introducing a different context or different goals, that is like the other case, right? That is what needs to be mentioned, because that's not what the culture is built around. It just isn't. And I guess what he would say to that is, or what he introduced earlier was like, oh, but the context and the agreed upon context and the environment in which we should speak in is what Kazuki Takahashi intended when he designed the game. No, it shouldn't. Like, rest in peace, Kazuki Takahashi, but what his mind set and what he had in mind for Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just not how the game is received and played. People want more competitive viability. They want things better than prize cards and Nintendo Switches, but Kazuki didn't. And his viewpoints and what he wanted directly conflicts with what the people who actually interface with the game based around his manga, what they want, right? It directly conflicts with it. And it's like, no, like the creator's intention, who cares? That's not how most people interface with Yu-Gi-Oh! The culture and what people are talking about, the general agreed upon context is, that's what the conversation is. That's what the topic is. And the creator's intent has very little to do with it. Has so little to do with it.
It's just not a useful conversation or mindset for us.
I mean, how do I know the creator's intent has so little to do with it? Just look at like what Yu-Gi-Oh! As a anime, as a story, what the morals are and what they express in the stories, and compare it to what reality is. Yu-Gi-Oh! As an anime, as a plot, as a story, likes to make fun of the Seto Kaibas, of the people who only care about the competition of the game, who don't believe in the heart of the cards, but believe in raw stats and numbers. They love to make fun of it, and they like to vilify it. But why you can see that the creator's intent has so little to do with the actual context of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a culture, as a phenomenon, is because that's like what the culture surrounds, right? The culture around Yu-Gi-Oh! Surrounds competitive viability, YCS tops, and raw numbers and data, because that's what the game caters to, right? That's what the game caters to. That's what the product caters to. And so to ignore that and say, oh, we should only focus on the creator's intent and design for the game, it's like, it's just, you're just objectively, you're choosing to ignore reality. You're basically choosing to live in a fantasy world that was purely constructed from your dreams and, whatever, right? It just doesn't correlate with reality, and it just doesn't, like, who cares? Who cares what you are talking about? We're not talking about that unless you're saying, hey, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about it in a different context. Let's talk about how my deck accomplishes my goals. Like, that's not what we're talking about. OG Kaiba was based off of a bully that gatekept Kazuki in his youth. OG Kaiba was an embodied meta elitist. Exactly. And that's exactly the culture and the type of players, the majority type of players that Yu-Gi-Oh! Breeds, because it is all about competitive viability, because that's the only way you can interface with Yu-Gi-Oh! And power creep is a huge thing. And it's just, that's what the game is. That's the context. Ignoring that is silly. Saying that we should ignore the general context, we should ignore general culture and make our own narrative and create our own context that has little to do with how people interface with the game is silly. Is absolutely silly.
For us to have as a community, rather than comparing cards and decks against each other in particular contexts for particular purposes, which allows us to actually evaluate whether or not we want to play them, it just becomes a proxy for whether or not we think a player is good or bad or valuable within the community. And that ain't what Yu-Gi-Oh!
Stop. I feel like tying in like my value as a human, value as a person into these discussions about like what is good, what is bad in a children's card game. I feel like that's so weird. That's so sad. It's like, that's not what we're talking about. Like, no one's trying to say that Abyss is a bad person or that they're a dumb player or that they're stupid, right? They're just saying like this archetype, this deck is not good in the general agreed upon context of what we gauge success in, which is competitive viability. Like, it doesn't, no one's trying to say or diminish your worth as a human. Just, you can like your things. Like, it's so silly. It seems so obvious.
Was about, you should define your success by what makes you happy, what makes you feel accomplished, what makes it so that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a more worthwhile thing for you to do with your time than something else.
Yes, you should. But when you're having a conversation on the internet, you're talking about something on Twitter, there are so little words that you can exchange. It's 140 characters, right? Or whatever. There are so little words you can exchange that there has to be an agreed upon context. There is a topic of discussion. There is an environment that you are entering and you're speaking in. And it is what is set in stone and established by the culture and created by the player base, and it's what's generally agreed upon. You have to understand that there is such a thing as a culture, that these constraints that are unspoken of are very real still, and that they do exist, and to ignore it just seems absolutely silly.
So go out there and play your Unchained, your Rescue Ace, your
Yes, please.
Ogdoadics, your Ursarctics, whatever it is that's going to achieve your reason for playing this game. And stop worrying about whether or not a deck is good or bad. Focus on your goals, your self-improvement, and how you're going to get there.
No, I don't. I mean, I mean, I'm sure he has very good intentions, and I understand where he's going off of, right? And he's trying to validate Abyss's opinion and, you know, validate the narrative of like, oh, everyone has their own level of success. I get that. I totally understand what he's going for, but I'm just saying, like, you can't ignore objective reality, right? That there is a culture, that there is an agreed upon context. You can't. I feel like if you're going on an online forum, you're trying to talk with someone online, right? You are entering a room, and that room has decorations. That room has different people. That room has a conversation already ongoing. And the conversation default is competitive viability. And that's what people are talking about.
And maybe think about supporting others in their journeys as well. Anyway, go forward in humble confidence, my friends, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.
Cool. I mean, I appreciate his viewpoint. And I definitely think he made his point very well. I disagree that, you know, ignoring the general context is at all what you should do, what you ought to do when having discussions on an online forum. I feel like the agreed upon context is what it is. And it is a culture that is breeded from the game, from the product, from the topic of discussion. And that, you know, like, oh, like everything is viable, everything is good, everything. It's like, who, like, of course your level of success is a personal thing, and what you gauge as success is personal. But when you're entering a room and there's an ongoing conversation, people are discussing certain things and they're talking about good and bad, and the context obviously is of competitive viability, because that's what Yu-Gi-Oh players care about. That's all they care about, right? Generally speaking. Then when you're saying, no, my deck isn't bad, my deck is good, and you're talking about something completely different, you have to acknowledge that you're talking about something completely different. Let's see what the TheDuelLogs was talking about. Let's see what beef Abyss had about his video for it. Okay, let's see.
How can an archetype have a draw 7 spell card and still be trash? This is a direct quote.
Okay, very simple. Off the bat, right? How can this archetype have something, draw 7, and still be trash? What is trash? In what context? It is the generally agreed upon context that Yu-Gi-Oh players defaultly enter the discussion with, and that is what the culture surrounds, and that is competitive viability. It's obvious. It makes sense. We're not talking about, you know, all these different little goals that you may have and gauge success in. It's clear and obvious. Is TheDuelLogs really saying that Ursarctics are unenjoyable, or that they can't top your locals, or that they don't do whatever the fuck I wanted to do? No. Like, we're talking about what the general agreed upon context is, what the general topic of discussion is, that all Yu-Gi-Oh players talk about by default, which is competitive viability. And that's clear in this intro. There's no can this deck not accomplish your goals? No. It's like, and so that's why I'm saying, like, with this video, it's like, that's not what we're talking about. That's not what anyone is talking about. Your worth as a human, your viability or whatever, and how good you are, how smart you are. Nobody's talking about that. Nobody's talking about that. And if they do eventually talk about that, then it's because the conversation has devolved to a point where it just is no longer about what the original topic is anymore. When he's saying Ursarctics are trash, it's very obvious that we're talking about the generally agreed upon context. When people play trash and they like to say, "Oh, my deck isn't bad. It's good. It's fine." Are we really going to conflate it and say like, "Oh my god, you're insulting me as a person, my value as a human being, my intelligence. You're saying my deck is trash and it doesn't accomplish." Like, why are we pretending? Stop. Why are we pretending like that's what we're talking about? It's not. It's just flat out isn't. Right? Why would I insult you? I have nothing against you. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. I think that was, as funny as that is, as annoyed about this topic as I am, like it's really funny how I came into this so excited, and at the end of it I'm like so like, I don't know, that it feels like we're just totally missing the point. I'm not angry. It's just like I'm annoyed. I'm disappointed. I feel like for something so obvious, it's like that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about like individual gauges of success. We're talking about like what is the agreed upon context. I feel like it's something obvious, and that's how I feel. I mean, let me know what you guys think. Definitely, I would love to know what people think about this.